It is nice to be back in Atlanta and at Emory, and so this is somewhat of a homecoming, and I promise I'm not going to digress too much, but I did actually briefly want to reflect just on my time here with the Transforming Community Project and my opportunity specifically to work very closely with Leslie Harris, and so this was in 2009, 2010, so already 5-6 years removed. Andrea in her introduction mentioned very briefly that I was doing work on the history of Emory as a training institution for missionaries who went to East Asia particularly. I'm happy to say that that work finally came out as an article in the Journal of Asian American Studies about a year ago. And so what you're actually looking at here is alumnus. I'm sure a number of you are probably familiar with Yoon Shi-ho, who went on to become a prominent politician and reformer in Korea. A very complicated history that I'm not going to get into too much here. You're also looking at this fascinating yearbook portrait of George Bell, who is a Chinese immigrant who was recruited to come and study with the Methodists here at Emory. And you see here him actually depicted in a Confederate battle uniform that he chose to wear for his portrait. So part of what my article deals with is the very complicated ways in which race relations inform the experience of Asian students at Emory in terms of making sense of the Jim Crow environment that they had been placed in and situated in, and in some ways followed them for the rest of their lives. So this is actually another photo that the Emory Alumni Association did in 1926, depicting a group of Emory alumni in Seoul, Korea. Yoon Shi-ho in the white frock, I guess you could say, in the middle. And again, part of what I was trying to tease out was how the agency and consumption of racialized bodies really became institutionalized to serve larger missionary agendas that institutions like Emory were very intimately involved in this period. In the case of Yoon and Bell, really the Methodist Episcopal Church South sought to project U.S. economic and religious power through their incorporation at Emory as native agents. And really, Yoon in his diary, he kept extensive diaries in English, tried to grapple with what it meant to be unable to escape the color line as it impacted his daily life, whether it was restrictions on his right to date white women, his encouragements of his white classmates to work with black churches in the Atlanta region, in Oxford, and all of the ways in which he seemed to constantly find his mission undermined by the inability to be fully accepted. I did a couple other things with the Transforming Community Project at Emory I just want to talk about briefly. One of the projects that I was particularly fond of was a set of oral histories that I worked on with a number of members of the Emory staff, where they interviewed fellow staff members about what race labor meant here on campus in terms of division of various roles and what constituted this larger community. So this is a portrait or picture of Donald Crawford, who was a painter. I'm not sure, to be honest, if he still works here. And I'm thinking of all of this in part, obviously, because I think all of us are aware of what's going on in campuses like Missouri, Yale in the last couple of weeks. And so I guess I have to say I was a little, it brought a tinge of sadness as well, right? In part because I think that the Transforming Community Project, when it was operation at Emory, was really absolutely crucial in terms of its commitment to providing the importance of critical historical context. And again, especially at a moment when the public's discussion of how students of color understand the need for safe spaces on campus, in my opinion, rarely engages the structural and psychological legacy of racist campus cultures or their continued impact. I mean, again, to me, it's just a sort of testimony to how important the work of the Transforming Community Project really was. And I'm actually, even here in the library, we actually did an exhibit called Picturing Race at Emory, where I worked with an undergraduate class, and they went into the archives upstairs and uncovered images that had either depicted or portrayed or somehow, grappled with the issue of race relations on campus. And I remember one student found this amazing photo from a 1960 yearbook, in the immediate years preceding the integration of Emory, or I should say the integration that allowed black students to attend Emory, because again, Asian students were incorporated in many ways much earlier. And the portrait she found was actually a white fraternity here on campus, basically staging a blackface performance of the sit-ins that were occurring in Atlanta in 1960 at department stores and diners, right outside the student union. And again, to me, this is the type of historical research that's absolutely illuminating and making sense and contextualizing why black students would be so concerned about whether the campuses they attend are indeed safe spaces, knowing how there is this enormous historical legacy of them not being safe spaces or being exclusionary spaces altogether. And in some ways, my last slide, before I get to the main body of my talk, I mean, this has really continued to inform how I think about my position and role as an academic at Rutgers. So I've been very much involved with an ongoing lawsuit, or it was just actually ruled in favor of the plaintiffs by the Third Circuit Court down in Philadelphia, involving the New York Police Department's surveillance and infiltration through undercover agents of the Muslim student associations on both the New Brunswick and the Newark campuses, in the attempts of plaintiffs to win redress as a result of the damages that surveillance caused. So this is just a poster from an event we did on campus. And so I just wanted to thank Leslie a lot. She was a really important mentor in my career, and it's great to be back and great to sort of thank her directly. So hopefully, without too much of an awkward transition, let me switch gears and now move towards the focus of my talk. And so I've prepared a talk that is combined with what I'll call frequent visual interruption, so hopefully I won't get too lectury. And I'm really excited for the question and answer period that'll follow, obviously. And I really, again, I'm excited also to use this as an opportunity to raise questions in terms of some of the final things I'm grappling with as I move my manuscript towards publication. And so, by no fault of Andre, the book title has changed slightly. Some guy named Sven Becker decided to come out with a book called The Empire of Cotton. So, decided I might need to distinguish how I'm thinking about empire a bit. So my forthcoming book, Brokering Servitude, Migration and Political Economies of Domesticity in the United States, 1850 to 1924, which will hopefully appear with NYU Press in either the fall of 2016 or maybe more realistically, the spring of 2017, argues that in the 19th century and early 20th century, servants were not the feudal remnants of a pre-industrial economic order predicated on master-servant relations, beholden to status rather than contract, as Jane Addams and other progressive reformers would argue in the early 20th century. But rather, they were test subjects in a new global division of labor, often refugees, like displaced famine Irish immigrants, and contraband freedwomen from the South, or permanent aliens ineligible to naturalize, like the Chinese immigrants relocated to domestic jobs that in the U.S. West, whites often refuse. The migrant workers I studied relied on the exchange value of their labor to win a highly selective and racialized form of social inclusion. At its core, my current book project poses the following questions. How did American households govern and regulate the performance of paid domestic labor by foreign and native migrant workers? How did the commodification of domestic and reproductive labor, encompassing cooking, cleaning, nursing, and caregiving, get framed as part of an ongoing market revolution in which various services were increasingly available for consumption through the provision of wages? Where does the history of capitalist production in American homes overlap and intersect with the perceived cultural work of assimilation, where the recruitment of migrant laborers into domestic service was perceived as a strategic means by which to secure both their literal and figurative incorporation into the nation in a hierarchical fashion? What roles did federal policymakers, social reformers, missionaries, and American corporate interests play in shaping the political economy of domestic service through the implementation of immigration laws and foreign policies that structured the connection of foreign and remote labor markets to concentrations of northern capital? Histories of domestic labor in the United States, while providing really important insights into the day-to-day experiences of wage laborers in the home, have mainly failed nonetheless to focus on the intertwined roles of the state and capital in producing servants as social, political, and racialized subjects. Drawing on the central idea of this book, servants were both included within the quote-unquote empire of the home as labor, yet kept on the outside when it came to rights and privileges. Middle-class families understood the incorporation of servants into the confines of their homes as a potentially dangerous process. While civilized forms of domesticity required outside laborers willing to do the menial work that middle-class women, and especially middle-class white women, held as beneath them, domestic stability, as the argument went, could also be destroyed by the presence of workers who refused to accept their subordinate role. And so E.L. Godkin, the founder and editor of The Nation, observed in 1869 that a fundamental paradox defined domestic service. And I'll quote him, "It has fallen to the lot of the Americans to be forced suddenly to receive into their houses a great body of aliens, fresh from a mode of life not very much superior to that of ancient Germans, as described by Tacitus," he argued, using the Roman Empire as his kind of prevailing historical analogy. "And to trust them for the performance without any preparation of the 1,000 small domestic duties on which so much human happiness depends." And I should note that Godkin was not alone in portraying domestic service as a colonial labor arrangement. My book challenges, in some respects, the standard historical chronology of American imperialism by arguing that many Americans first thought about and considered empire not necessarily through the lens of foreign policy, but through labor relations in their homes instead. And so I would argue that the ideology of American imperialism cannot be relegated to the study of foreign policy and overseas expansion, beginning in that kind of bellwether moment of the 1890s, and that, again, obviously ignores the complications of settler colonialism as well, which I'll definitely address a bit in this talk, but rather needs to be understood as part of a broader and earlier cultural debate about how the mobilization of foreign and domestic surplus labor could solve shortages caused by the end of slavery and the unwillingness of whites to perform certain forms of labor understood as degraded. And so how race was managed and constructed as either a marker of shared interest or a mutable difference was really crucial in this regard. Whereas Anglo-American employers, and I'll talk about this in much more detail in a moment, consistently bemoan the Catholicism and cultural practices of Biddy, which was the sort of counterpart to the stereotype of mammy that was constantly circulated in popular discourse, at the same time she was marked as a laborer whose value also resided in her potential to perform reproductive work, that she might contribute to the nation as a permanent settler, as a mother. Male Chinese immigrants and American-born black women may have been idealized as servants in quite sharp contrast to Biddy, but this in turn meant that they could never be citizens. Even if all domestic laborers were subject to various forms of capitalist exploitation and were quite literally alienated as non-family members from the domesticity they produced, white women could at least claim citizenship as aspirant mothers and agents of white reproduction. And so that's kind of the book as a whole, and I'll segue to the more specific three main arguments I, in a sense, would like to test here today. So one of the things I'll really be focusing on is, in deference to the thematic of the colloquium in particular, but certainly, because it's also very much present in my work, how race and difference are understood in the context of market practices and behavior that immigrant Irish women, native-born black women, and Chinese immigrant men are purportedly entitled to engage in around the idea of freedom of contract. And so a major inspiration for my work as well has been Amy Drew Stanley and her work on this idea of freedom of contract. Again, just to kind of clarify what I mean when I reference freedom of contract, right, is this kind of cherished liberal notion that real freedom is defined by the individual's ability to consent to the sale of her or his labor power. And, in the debates, obviously, on slavery, is considered the antithesis to the forced and coerced expropriation of labor under that particular system. But as Stanley argues, right, free labor is ultimately an invented concept. It's an exceptional idea for the people who are told to adjust their lives and activities to it as the standard of freedom of which they should pursue. And in no ways it's not a natural default status, as free labor ideologues would continually argue for this period. And so in some ways, right, I'm really concerned with the ritualization of freedom of contract, because it becomes incredibly essential to what people debate or argue should be the way in which labor markets operate, right? The notion that individual laborers need to discipline any type of freedom of contract that in some ways is abusive of the larger social contract undergirding capitalism. The other major argument, I'll come back to all of this if it's still not clear, hopefully it'll become more clear. I also want to put capitalism into conversation, or histories of capitalism, with the increased emphasis on Foucault's idea of biopower or biopolitics. And so I'm going to be talking in part about the ideals of biopower in the North, oriented around the domestic division of labor, again, into these reproductive and menial categories, right? How labor in the home is divided in biopolitical or biopower terms. In some ways arguing that in the mid-century, this is a dramatic departure from, at least in the North, the help system that predominated in advance. And we could argue, and it's kind of an aside, whether the help system was ever as sort of fulsome as its proponents made it out to be. But what I say when I talk about help system are these sort of idyllic depictions of the 13-year-old white farm girl in rural New England who contributes labor to a neighbor's household with the expectation that this is sort of tutelage or training for her own Republican motherhood that she'll later seize upon as she goes through a life course. I argue that with the mass immigration of Irish immigrants and the end of slavery and the new potential availability of black labor from the South, that this is what really puts an end to that sort of imagined kind of yeoman ideal of domestic labor, if you will. And what emerges in the absence is this new market forms, practices, and experimentations that relies on, again, the division of racialized labor. The third major point I want to make is that, or want to think through, I should say, how free labor never emerges in time of peace and stability, but is almost always the product of social conflict and crisis that, quote unquote, frees people from pre-existing relationships of production and social sovereign governance. And so again, I think in some ways, obviously, freed women and men are the most obvious examples here, right? In the sense that they literally have to be, at least as Northern free labor advocates argue, reconstructed as free laborers. But I would also contend that Irish and Chinese immigrants really fit this mold as well, as entrants into a newly globally integrated market economy who are in some ways compelled to make their migrations because they've lost access to traditional ways of subsistence. And so in some ways I'm riffing off Karl Polanyi's famous argument about the Great Transformation and what capitalism does to social structures, especially around production in the household. And so obviously this debate about the relationship between humanitarianism and capitalism in some ways I think is incredibly relevant to what we're dealing with in the contemporary context that we are seeing in the news constantly, and in some ways has really have been molded into modern immigration policy, right? That false binary or distinction between the economic migrant who is not afforded asylee status or not afforded a refugee status versus the kind of political machinations that determine who is a refugee. I would say that we need to go back in the past, see how those distinctions have always been collapsed in order to kind of make our way for a more complex appreciation of what's going on in the present. Right. I will get to images in a second, don't worry. Market demand for servants informed a division of labor that followed what the anthropologist and cultural theorist Anne-Laure Stoller has described as the evaluation of different groups, quote, implicit cultural competencies. Stoller observes that, quote, colonialism was at once a comparative endeavor which relied on the differentiation of individuals within the population that constituted a colonial society and was, quote, a protracted war of assessments over what could be measured by common principles of right and rule and who should be exempted or excluded from them. Irish servants posed a significant test to the free labor ideology of the northern United States during the late antebellum and Reconstruction eras. Their alleged behavior as workers drew intense political scrutiny to how wage contracts and the volatile, speculative labor markets for domestic service operated both in practice and in relationship to theories of laissez-faire capitalism. During the second half of the 19th century, hundreds of general interest periodicals, women's journals, and newspapers published thousands of stories investigating the various dimensions of the servant problem. Articles dwelling specifically on the tribulations that came with the employment of Biddy, again, the nickname for Bridget and the stock figure and stereotype of the Irish female servant who was insolent, confrontational, and dangerously unfit to exercise sovereignty over the production of home life, formed a considerable library on its own, as one author noted. As historians and literary scholars have addressed, commentary on domesticity proved to be a profitable cultural industry in its own right. The commercialization of household production led to a corresponding rise in the circulation of domestic expertise, humor, and firsthand accounts of struggles with servants, and employers, women and men alike, ravenously consumed this information in order to stay versed in the latest managerial practices. And I'm actually going to jump ahead in time a little bit and then move backwards, but I wanted to share with you this fascinating, horrifying, captivating, complex cartoon that was published in Puck, the main humor magazine out of New York in 1891, titled The Intelligence Office of the Future. And so in some ways, to me, this embodies a lot of what I'm talking about, or encapsulates a lot of what I'm talking about, because it shows sort of the aftermath of the struggle against Biddy, framed in this kind of growing awareness of the United States' potential for overseas expansion, with references to previous acts of settler colonialism, right? So the first individual depicted is a Sioux squaw who is willing to do anything but wash, right? Again, this kind of racialized stereotype of hygienic practices. We then have an Eskimo lady who has no objection to working in the suburbs. So the reference there being that Irish immigrant laborers, in some ways in which they exercised their freedom of contract, was by denying and refusing positions that would remove them far from the core of the community in Lower Manhattan. You see one of Stanley's pygmies, again, the joke being once a place in a small family, but the larger context of reference, kind of once you get beyond the immediacy of the sort of racist comment, is that Irish servants, again, often refused to work in large families. They would interrogate employers about how many kids they had and then base a decision to contract their labor on those circumstances. We see an African Amazon, again, willing to live in Brooklyn, as the commentary goes, and then a Turkish lady who does not go out or does not care to go out at night, if you can't read the kind of small text here, right? And so it's arguing, right, that the future intelligence office by 1891 will be populated by these figures, right, who will be more exploitable, more amenable to attempts to locate them or place them in positions that Irish immigrants, despite their liminal whiteness, still possess the agency to, in some ways, deny or prevent. And this cartoon, despite being about 30 years after, is clearly riffing on earlier versions of this thematic. So this is from 1863, a lithograph that appeared in Harper's Weekly, depicting and so intelligence office, I should have clarified, is just the kind of 19th century term for an employment agency. Here we see an Irish servant, again, visually cued into that with the slightly simianized features, hosting prospective employers, right? Asking them a set of questions about their credentials, requiring them to provide references from their peers and neighbors, right? In some ways depicting what middle-class white women worried was this complete inversion of power, right? Where the laborer could use the intelligence office as a base or locus of making demands on employers. And we see this nearly constantly throughout this era, again, moving even slightly ahead of time. So this is a cartoon from Puck from 1880, our servant girls. I'll call your attention to just the upper left-hand panel at first, right? Depicting an impoverished, pauper Irish immigrant arriving at Castle Garden in rags, right? And in part, commenting on the rapid transition that this refugee who would seek employment opportunities in the US could make to this emboldened figure who would again inspect ladies who were hoping to employ her, who would be able to entertain her friends and guests in her employer household, who would force, if you see the middle panel and the lower, her employer to beg her to stay on the job rather than leave before a big meal that was planned. And you see with the attached kind of text, this is the fear, right? The demands that servants would make, the abuse of their freedom of contract that it was worried that Irish immigrants in particular would have. And you see, beginning around the Civil War and Reconstruction, a kind of attempt as well to isolate freedmen and women who are coming north to New York City from what are considered these pernicious Irish immigrant influences. The belief that if black workers experienced the ability of Irish immigrants to use the intelligence office as a base of power, they would emulate this type of abuse of freedom of contract as well. And again, you get this sort of, these are often called the servant's catechism. Again, a kind of play on words with the Irish servant's Catholicism, but the kind of rote list of questions they would subject any prospective employer to. And I'll skip ahead because I know I'm always going to run out of time if I'm not careful. I'll just show you one more image because I also want to make an argument, I think, that what's occurring is actually quite global in terms of how people are thinking about race. So this is actually from the British or English publication Punch from 1853, part of a series of political cartoons that the illustrator John Leach publishes called Servant Gallism, the idea being kind of the ideology of servant gals, depicting two English servants complaining about the work that's been imposed upon them. And you'll notice that in the actual language, one of the servants says, "I've made up my mind not to stop here, no longer to work like Negroes as we do." And so in some ways, I would argue that this wage slavery debate that's central to politics in the US in the 1850s really takes on a kind of global resonance, right? So you have white English servants invoking what types of work are suitable for servants of their race, at least as they construct and imagine it. Authors' impassioned rhetoric, and actually let me just take a step back, right? And so and another thing I'm kind of trying to do here in the book, at least, and also in what I'm sharing right now, is that just it's also essential to call attention to the home as a marketplace. So some scholars like Laurie Marish in her book on sentimental materialism, Kristen Hoganson on the idea of the home as a consumer's imperium that exposes American consumers to the kind of global market of goods from China and so forth. I found that none of them really take on labor as a sort of product of consumption as well, right? The idea that in some ways the home is first opened up to the idea of kind of global divisions of race and status through the employment of workers, right? And so one of the arguments, or one of the questions I'm curious is why the consumption of labor power has really eluded similar scrutiny or has been in some ways relegated to women's history as almost a separate sort of affair to capitalism. I think there's a lot of pitfalls in this approach. In some ways, I've been informed by the social historian's Walter Johnson's argument, right, that the performances and rituals that domestic labor marketplaces were key to enacting were actually crucial to how the identity and subjectivity of workers operated in practice. And so Johnson obviously is focusing on slavery, but making the argument that the slave market is ironically in some respects where the slave refutes her or his social death, right? They become animated within the context of consumption, quite literally being told to perform in certain ways to enhance their market value. I would argue that many of these themes carry over to the free labor marketplace of the home as well. Authors' impassioned rhetoric about the need to segregate the sacred world of the home from the profane realm of commerce masked the extent to which employers were constantly engaged in consumer and managerial behavior that made them responsible for both the consumption of immigrant labor and its supervision. No matter how much they decried the necessity of having to undertake such roles, hiring and overseeing the conduct of Irish servants became an important basis for how Anglo-American women employers identified culturally with each other as a discrete class and in how they developed a collective managerial consciousness. Participation in labor markets reshaped household employers' identities and subjectivities and became normalized as practice and culture. Despite the recruitment challenges that labor scarcities posed in this era, the expectation remained that employers would not let themselves be victim to the market and that they would put aside whatever reservations they had about commercial action. Moreover, they were to pursue political reforms that allowed them to regulate domestic labor through the state as well. And so I want to transition because I want to talk about Castle Garden as a kind of labor depot and intelligence office before I move into talking about the Freedmen's Bureau. But the framing point would be to think about the different ways in which state bodies are regulating labor markets for migrant workers in this era. In July 1857, a reporter for Harper's Weekly observed, for instance, that the cost of, quote, consignments arriving from Ireland in the form of immigrant women destined for domestic labor positions had increased nearly as much as the price of beef, tea, and sugar in New York. Raw immigrants entering the labor market as maids of all work were demanding wages of $5 a month, the article noted, whereas only a year earlier, inexperienced servants earned monthly wages of only $3 to $4 a month at best. Dramatic fluctuations in the cost of labor were virtually unheard of during the first part of the 19th century, and Seth Rockman has done some work on this, when a customary wage for women's labor prevailed in most urban areas, or labor needs were satisfied by slave labor, and supply before the massive influx of German and Irish immigrants remained relatively fixed. Moreover, since, and this is back to the Harper's Weekly article, Biddy and her friends were extensive consumers of household staples whose prices had also risen, the article explained with sarcasm, expenses had gone up on all fronts. And the author would go on to argue that essentially Castle Garden had to do a better job, and I should say more specifically, the labor exchange expelling immigrant women who refused to take the positions first offered to them. That the way in which they could police abuses of freedom contract was to quite literally force immigrant women onto the labor market. And this in some ways proved to be quite controversial, and this is where I think biopower in some ways re-enters the position. Even by the 1850s, there were many Irish politicians in New York who basically argued that Castle Garden should indeed serve as a refuge. It should serve as a place where Irish immigrant women could more actively shop for positions. Given the widespread controversy that surrounded intelligence offices, it was perhaps inevitable that the state did become involved as a broker of immigrant domestic labor. And so at Castle Garden, not only does this take the form of expelling immigrant women, but it also takes the form of sort of regulating the labor market itself, right? Creating an environment where immigrant women were, for example, quarantined from immigrants who had already arrived, who might be able to provide them with knowledge and advice on prevailing market conditions, creating quite literally sort of barricades that separated workers from each other when they were being actively shopped to prospective employers. You'll see in 1876, and I'm going to talk about this more in my book, obviously, there's a big controversy that pits the Irish Emigrant Protective Society against the New York State bureaucrats who operate the Labor Bureau at Castle Garden. One of those bureaucrats gets frustrated by what he accuses of the frequent sort of use of the intelligence office at Castle Garden by Irish immigrant women who would go to a position, 2 weeks later come back, look for another position, and so on and so forth. And he argues that this is just, and this is the list he provides to the investigative committee of the New York State legislature with the names of, again, notorious offenders. He argues that this is not only a sort of abuse of freedom of contract, but abets criminal activity. But what you see really interesting actually in this debate, just almost as a kind of aside real briefly, is that you have a number of Irish American politicians who intervene and argue that, well, employers are actually to be accused of the kind of malpractice in this case. They'll hire servants for 2 weeks, fire them before having to pay their monthly wages, and that explains the kind of constant recidivism, if you will, in terms of the use of the Labor Bureau as a kind of site for hiring. I want to transition to my discussion of the Freedmen's Bureau. Is that clock accurate? Is it 12:40 already? Wow. Okay, so I will try to wrap up in just 10 minutes or so to give us a lot of time for question and answering period. In a jointly authored 1863 letter to President Abraham Lincoln addressing the Emancipation Proclamation, representatives of the Freedmen Aid Societies in Boston, Cincinnati, New York, and Philadelphia argued that the nation's demand for servants meant that black labor was, quote, destined to be the great one of the country over which we are extending our victorious dominion. They went on to say, in what I would call biopolitical terms, that the president should be instructed to, quote, be sure that every Negro life which can be preserved in this transition state is a life which, at any reasonable or probable cost, it is in the highest degree economical to preserve. As if to almost assuage their own guilt over the language they were using and their stark commodification of what they perceived to be the sellable value of black lives and labor, the representatives of the Freedmen's Relief Agencies did find space to add that, apart from political economy, there is a moral economy to be considered as well. Moral and religious training, the authors noted, flowed naturally from relations of servitude. With the war, contrabands quickly discovered that being relegated to servile domestic labor, even when free, represented a tortuous path to equality. This point was exemplified in an article published by the United States Service magazine, which described how a slave who had freed himself by joining the 1st Iowa Cavalry, then stationed in Tennessee, was administered a citizenship oath by a Union corporal where he was required to solemnly swear to not only uphold the Constitution, but also to, quote, see that there are no grounds floating in the coffee. And again, so I would argue from the very beginning, right, there's this sort of winding path to citizenship that with black labor runs very much through the sort of imagined capitalist exploitation of their freedom. And so the Civil War conflict forged in the national political dispute over whether slavery would be allowed to continue its westward expansion, in some respects had the largely unanticipated result of raising the entirely different question of whether newly freed black laborers could be successfully imported to the North in order to diversify the supply of domestics that household employers could hire. Northern employers enthusiastically hypothesized about the potential that this new source of labor had to displace Irish labor's monopoly. To the Union Army and after the war, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, the Freedmen's Bureau, and affiliated organizations that collaborated with the federal agency, Northern demand offered an opportunity not only to mobilize a new source of labor, but also critically to lessen government relief expenditures being spent on contrabands and refugees, and to relocate women and children who had been widowed, orphaned, and otherwise isolated from their families to homes where their dependent status, as it was understood, could be put to productive uses. The dispatches that Union officials, journalists, and missionaries sent from the South, filled as they were with excitement about the possible uses of contraband labor, illustrates that many Northerners viewed free slaves as a distinct species of labor who bore little in common with blacks already acculturated to the free labor system. In August 1861, for example, with the war less than half a year old, the Independent magazine proclaimed that, quote, the troublesome experiences of Northern households with domestic labor was on the verge of undergoing a revolution in the mode of production, and that with the, quote, immigration of runaway slaves, and I'll emphasize the word immigration just to show the kind of parallel ways of thinking about labor supplies, employers should not have any compunctions about taking advantages of blacks, quote, peculiar talent for service, so long as the service they were offering was contracted freely. Horace James, a Congregationalist minister from Massachusetts, commissioned as the superintendent of Negro Affairs in North Carolina in 1864, Fused at the abolition of slavery was creating a nation of servants awaiting employment. The foolish prejudice against color which prevails, even among the best people of the North, he argued, should immediately give way, that they may make their proper place in our households. And as I argue in the larger book project, this refrain would really feature prominently in the statements of proponents of Chinese immigration as well, in the 1860s, 1870s, all the way up to 1882 in the Chinese Restriction Act, in the sense that it was similarly argued that, especially as Western exclusionist movements gained pace, that the refugee crisis that this would create as well could be channeled to Northern households, that this too would create a new source of labor. And you even have Howard, the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau, making a general sort of proclamation that one of the main tasks of the Freedmen's Bureau would be to create intelligence offices. And it's actually somewhat ironic, or not somewhat, it's very ironic, given the widespread condemnation of intelligence offices specializing in domestic labor in this era, that Howard, in this December 1865 report to Congress, would propose Freedmen's Bureau agents operating in this context. In reality, the labor brokers who became involved in placing freed women and children in Northern homes, especially those concentrated in Washington, D.C., which is scholars like Kate Major have argued, right, became the major refugee sort of city for displaced black freedmen and women. Most of these placement offices, traced their operation to relief agencies that were operating in the war, but then continued afterwards. I'll give you an example. So this is actually an organization sponsored by the New York and Brooklyn Freedmen's Employment Bureau, again, recruiting colored domestic and employees from the South, explaining how they would place these women and children, and I emphasize children as well, because one of the sort of key sources of labor to imagine were orphan children. So the idea that they could actually be acquired even without pay, so long as white employers in New York adhered to state law, which required that they at least be allowed to receive an education. So in some ways, imagining a kind of free source of dependent labor. St. John, the author of this particular flyer, despite his promotional enthusiasm, expressed private concerns about whether granting too much independence to migrant blacks would actually undermine the cause of their employment or their improvement by creating widespread pauperism in northern cities. And again, the overlap here being this is a constant refrain that Irish immigrants are subjected to, in many similar ways placed out to the Midwest, or what would then be understood as the Old Northwest, where again, they could be more integrated into households. The Freedmen's Bureau set up so this is another agency that began operating out of Farmington, Connecticut, actually sponsored by A.F. Williams, who was a white Congregationalist, who was a prominent abolitionist, had been involved in the resettlement of the mutineers on the Amistad back in the 1840s. And again, so he got a salary from the Freedmen's Bureau, became an agent. If he received a request from white families in the Farmington, Connecticut area, he would write to Josephine Griffin, who was the main agent in Washington, D.C., responsible for sending freed men and women out to jobs, and he would then place them in local homes. And as you might have noticed in the text, one of the sort of interesting features of this arrangement, and this is where the state, I guess, I would argue, gets involved in sort of also policing the distribution of relief. If a freed woman, for example, had a position made available to her, say in Farmington, Connecticut, and was then given money by the Bureau to make the train trip north, and refused the placement, said that she did not want to leave DC, that she did not want to go north, she lost her eligibility for local relief in Washington. So again, right, as much as we speak about sort of the consensual free labor system that emerges in this era, there are all types of ways in which, again, this is highly problematic, not operating in any sort of abstract, fully realized form that the proponents said it would. These letters are going to be hard to read, so I will summarize for you. One is just from a man in Vermont, a white man by the name of Dutcher, who complains to the Freedmen Bureaus that he had paid Josephine Griffin to hire 2 black girls as servants, and this is the language he used, and that they never arrived. And so not only did he want his money back, to him it raised larger questions as a taxpayer. Interesting use of language, even in the 1860s, whether the Freedmen Bureau was accurately sort of using people's income and tax money in its duties. Again, in this kind of really sort of conflated, interesting language of kind of, I am a taxpayer, this is a service I paid for on multiple levels, but he also at one point says that he's also just trying to help black refugees, right? So unclear in his own mind whether this is sort of a capitalistic pursuit of labor or a humanitarian extension of sort of relief. The other is just from a man by the name of Bloss in Rochester, Michigan, who again threatens to write his congressman because the servants he was supposed to receive via DC never arrived. And I raise all of this just in part because it explains, I think, largely why the program was halted in October 1867. This is the last time the Freedmen Bureau will pay for the transportation to place out women and children and men from DC to remote locations. The worry is that it's subject to government corruption. Again, parallel to Castle Garden, you see this happening as well with the various investigations of Tammany Hall's influence on the Labor Bureau. But also that, in some ways, it's either going to fail or become too coercive. There's going to be too many necessary policing mechanisms for the placement of black workers that, in some ways, it will become essentially slavery revisited. And because I know I'm almost out of time, I just want to kind of make a couple final points. I realized I didn't have too much opportunity to talk about my work that looks at Chinese immigrants, but again, to kind of do this through visuals briefly, this is a cartoon from 1882 that appeared in The Wasp, which was the San Francisco-based humor magazine. Again, imagining the servant question as primarily one that emerges through the lens of the abuse of freedom of contract. So again, you have this catechism, you have a group of Irish immigrant servants hounding this presumably middle-class white Anglo-American woman. You have a Chinese servant floating in the background with the text, "No questions asked," right? Imagined as this pliable, manageable source of labor that could simply fulfill all the demands. So in some level, this is, blatantly racist, no doubt. But in some ways, it's also structural. Increasingly, you'll get arguments because Chinese women are prohibited from immigrating to the US. Chinese men are bachelors. So unlike white women, or even increasingly by the 1880s, black women in places where the living out system hasn't been introduced yet, the idea is that servants are constantly being lost to marriage. The Chinese man can't get married by the structural sort of policing of immigration and therefore can be maintained as a captive labor for much longer times, reduces turnover. I'll skip these just because I'm almost out of time. The final points I want to make in my conclusion, the final kind of interesting parallel in respect to agency that I draw out in the larger book project is that if you were to ask the black freed women who refused to be placed out to rural towns in the north, to places like Rochester, Michigan, why they refused to go, and in the few accounts of this that we do have, the typical answer is that they did not want to be isolated from their communities. They did not want to be placed in remote locations where they would quite literally be an object of fascination as people scrutinized how they performed as newly freed laborers. Interestingly, you see this with Irish immigrants as well. When they're told to go to states like Illinois or Wisconsin, where they can partake in settler colonialism and become white mothers, they refuse. They choose to stay in places like the 5 Points of New York, in the Lower East Side more generally. Even with Chinese immigrants, you see this as well, right? When they're told to go to New York to help relieve the servant crisis in the 1870s there, they don't. They refuse. They stay in San Francisco, where their communities are. And I would say that this is a common sort of attempt to resist being alienated from the means of producing self, to put it in sort of more theoretical terms, right? Through the networks that allow them escape from the worst abuses that come with intimate labor, right? To stay among their communities, to not be put in places that are going to be exploitative, and also to potentially imagine futures where they are their own biopolitical agents, and not the consumed labor of others. And in this sense, I think that, I'll end by just kind of citing the black nationalist Martin Robinson Delaney, who as early as the 1850s, and my argument is making a case for settler colonialism precisely to resist racialized social relations of production, when he wrote in his 1852 publication, The Condition, Elevation, Emigration, and Destiny of the Colored People of the United States, that, quote, "We cannot at the same time be domestic and lady, servant and gentleman. We must be the one or the other." And Delaney believed that prohibitions against black land ownership, education, and businesses would perpetually mean that black migrants would never find a community in the United States where their enlistment as servants was only a temporary status rather than a permanent relegation. And in some ways, I think this is a commonality that we see all laborers who are relegated to servility aspiring to. Thank you.